I buried my husband on a freezing Tuesday afternoon in Boston. By Friday morning, my parents had already decided that I was a liability they were no longer willing to carry. I was 23 years old, 7 months pregnant with twin boys, and standing in the center of their pristine, immaculate living room. Rain was still dripping from the hem of my coat, pooling onto their flawless hardwood floors. My mother sat on the white velvet sofa, her arms tightly folded, her eyes as sharp and unforgiving as broken glass. My father stood at the floor-to-ceiling window with his back completely turned to me, staring out at the grey city skyline, as if my grief and my swollen belly were simply too ugly for him to look at. "We've discussed it thoroughly, Savannah," my mother said, her voice dropping like a heavy sheet of ice. "This is not our responsibility. You chose to marry him despite our warnings. You made your choices. Now you will have to live with them." "Mom, I have nowhere else to go," I whispered, my voice trembling as I instinctively wrapped my arms around my stomach. Ethan's medical bills swallowed every dime of our savings. The treatments, the hospital stays. It took everything. I'm carrying twins. I just need a place to stand until the babies are born. She tilted her head, a cold, mocking gesture of mock sympathy. "You should have thought about the financial realities before you ran off with a school teacher. We are not funding your poor decisions." My father never turned around. Not once. He didn't offer a word of comfort, nor did he look at his daughter who was drowning in sorrow. 10 minutes later, I walked out into the pouring rain, dragging a single suitcase, with a belly so heavy I could barely catch my breath. That was the last time I stood in their house, and it would be the last time I saw them for 16 long years. What saved my life wasn't a miracle. It was the family I had married into. My mother-in-law, Clara, drove 6 hours through a torrential storm from her small farm in upstate New York to come get me. She didn't say much on the long, silent drive back to her place. She just reached across the console and held my hand tightly while I sobbed silently against the passenger window. 2 months later, when the twins were born, 2 tiny, screaming boys named Liam and Owen, both carrying their father's striking blue eyes, Clara was right there in the delivery room. She held one baby while I held the other, washing away the bitter taste of abandonment with pure, unconditional love. My father-in-law, George, didn't hesitate either. He took out a second mortgage on his own farmhouse just to help me stand back up on my feet. He gave me a small, neglected parcel of their land, an old battered stable, and 4 rescue horses that desperately needed rehabilitation. "Start here, Savannah," George said, wiping his grease-stained hands on a rag. "You've always had a special gift with animals. Focus on them. And don't worry about this land. An old surveyor once told me there's a strange, deep water table sitting right underneath this valley. He said it sits on something incredibly rare. Maybe it'll be worth something to you someday." At the time, I barely absorbed his words. I didn't care about rare water tables or future fortunes. I just saw a sanctuary, a fragile place to survive, and shield my sons from the coldness of the world. That first year was a blur of exhaustion. I worked from 4 o'clock in the morning until I physically collapsed at night. I mucked stalls, trained difficult horses, and spent every free midnight hour reading textbooks about equine breeding, bloodlines, and anatomy. Clara watched the twins, ensuring they were safe and fed, while George taught me how to negotiate with tight-fisted suppliers twice my age, who refused to take a young grieving widow seriously. But by the time Liam and Owen were toddlers, the financial strain hit an absolute wall. Feed prices skyrocketed, and the stable was bleeding cash. That was when I remembered something my grandmother had told me right before she passed away, She had set aside a small private trust fund in my name. $60,000. It wasn't an empire, but it would have been more than enough to keep the stables afloat and give my boys a stable winter. I scraped together my birth certificate, the old legal notices, and drove down to the corporate bank office in downtown Boston. The branch manager looked at the account, then looked up at me with an uncomfortable expression. The account was empty. It had been completely zeroed out years earlier, right around the time I turned 18. When he showed me the physical withdrawal forms, my breath caught in my throat. The signatures on the bottom looked remarkably like mine, but they weren't. The elegant, cursive slant belonged to a hand I knew all too well. I sat in my battered truck in the bank parking lot, staring at those forged papers until the black ink blurred into a mess. I knew exactly who had stolen my future. Driven by a sudden surge of raw fury, I drove straight to my parents' estate. My mother answered the door, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw my face. Before she could slam it, I jammed the forged bank statements directly into the doorway. She glanced down at the papers like they were pieces of junk mail, her expression shifting into a bored, icy sneer. "That money was gone long before you ever thought you needed it, Savannah," she said coldly, looking past me at my old truck. "And frankly, you weren't entitled to a single dime of our family's legacy after the embarrassing spectacle you made of yourself by leaving us. Don't come back here playing the victim." She clicked the lock, and the heavy oak door shut firmly in my face. I stood on that pristine driveway, surrounded by the quiet wealth of a neighborhood that had discarded me. But this time, I didn't shed a single tear. I made a quiet, burning promise to myself right there in the frost. I was too broke, too exhausted, and too legally powerless to fight their army of corporate lawyers right then. But I would survive. I would build something so massive, so solid, and so undeniable that one day my parents would have no choice but to watch me dismantle their entire world. What nobody knew, least of all my parents, was that George's casual comment about the deep water table underneath the farm would become the cornerstone of my revenge. It took 5 grueling years for the ranch to finally break even. I lived on coffee, adrenaline, and the sight of my boys growing up strong and capable. By the 8th year, we had earned a reputation for producing elite quarter horses. Buyers began flying in from across the globe: Dubai, Germany, and California. My boys were growing up in the saddle, strong and quiet, watching their mother fight for every single inch of ground we stood on. By year 12, the ranch was an empire. I had 20 full-time employees, a breeding program that attracted international attention, and a bank account that finally reflected the years of agony I had poured into the soil. But I never forgot the trust fund. I kept every scrap of evidence, the forged signatures, the bank letters, and the timeline of their theft, in a secure safety deposit box. During the rare hours when I wasn't mucking stalls, I taught myself just enough about forensic accounting and corporate law to understand that what my parents had done wasn't just a betrayal, it was a felony. Then, the Water Rights Corporation came knocking. They were doing a massive geological survey of the region and needed to test the aquifer deep beneath our land. When their lead geologists looked at the initial data from our wells, they stopped talking in business terms and started talking in whispers. The composition of the water and the sheer volume of the underground supply were unprecedented. The negotiations started slow, then accelerated, then exploded. The corporate interest shifted from a simple land lease to an outright acquisition of the entire acreage. When the final offer was finally slid across my mahogany desk, I stared at the number so long that my assistant leaned over, concerned that I had actually suffered a stroke. $100 million. I sold the ranch 3 months later. My boys were set for life, and George and Clara finally had the security they had sacrificed everything to give me. I thought I had finally buried every ghost the past had carved into my bones. But as I was finalizing the move to a private estate, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I recognized the voice that answered the moment I picked up. "Savannah?" It was my mother. The voice was thin, honeyed, and dripping with a poison I hadn't tasted in 16 years. "Sweetheart," she continued, not waiting for me to speak. "We've been trying to reach you for weeks. We heard the wonderful news about the sale. We're so incredibly proud of the woman you've become. We want to see you. We want to be a family again." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. Instead, I felt something shift deep inside me. A sensation cold, sharp, and precise. It was like a key finally turning in a rusted lock I had been building for nearly 2 decades. "Of course, Mom," I said, my voice eerily calm. "Let's have a family dinner. I think it's time we catch up." What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that I hadn't been waiting passively while I built my fortune. 3 years earlier, once the ranch was profitable enough to fund a multi-year legal battle, I had quietly hired the best forensic accounting firm in Boston. They had spent months tracing every forged signature, every hidden transfer, and every shell account my parents had used to bury the theft of my trust fund. They had mapped out the web of greed that had sustained my parents' lifestyle for years. The lawsuit had been filed and prepared months before the sale was even finalized. The final court order, authorizing the seizure of their assets, landed in my hands on the very morning of the dinner. I invited them to a private, high-end restaurant in the city. I also invited Clara and George, the only parents who had ever actually earned the title. My twins were grown men now, and they knew every detail of the story. When I finally sat them down and told them the full, unvarnished truth, they sat in silence, their jaws tight with a restrained fury that mirrored my own. When I asked them if they were ready, they didn't hesitate. They stood by me, ready to watch the foundation of the Dentons' world finally crack. The dinner was set for Saturday evening. My parents arrived first, dressed like royalty in tailored silk and expensive wool, their arms open wide in a practiced, theatrical performance of reconciliation. My mother hugged me with the breathless intensity of an actress accepting an award she didn't deserve, while my father shook my hand with the firm, clinical grip of a man closing a lucrative business deal. They barely glanced at Liam and Owen. Their eyes were too busy scanning the restaurant, calculating the value of the venue, and searching for signs of the fortune they intended to reclaim. We sat down, and the tension hummed beneath the polite pleasantries like a live wire. Finally, I stood up and tapped my glass. "I want to thank everyone for coming," I said. "This dinner is about family, about loyalty, and about gratitude for the people who were truly there when it mattered." My mother beamed, already leaning forward, clearly expecting a grand announcement of a vacation home or a massive cash infusion. "That's why I have a gift tonight," I continued, sliding a leather folder toward Clara and George. "For the people who gave me everything when I had nothing. So now, I am giving something back." They opened it, and my parents leaned over, their expressions frozen in sudden, dawning shock. Inside was a deed to 500 acres of prime Montana ranch land, fully paid, stocked, and supported by a 10-year operating trust. "Savannah," Clara whispered, her hand shaking over her mouth. "This is too much." "It's not enough," I replied. "You mortgaged your home for me. You raised my boys. This is only a fraction of what you deserve." My parents' faces had drained to a sickly, ash white. They weren't looking at Clara and George anymore. They were looking at me, and I could read the raw calculation in their eyes as they realized every dime of my success was flowing away from them. My mother recovered first, forcing a brittle, splintered smile. "Well, that's very generous, sweetheart. But we were hoping to talk privately about the future. Our future as a family." "Oh, I haven't forgotten about you," I said, my voice perfectly even. "I have something for you, too." I slid a thicker, heavy legal folder across the white tablecloth. My mother's manicured fingers trembled as she pulled out a court-ordered asset seizure authorization. "You remember the trust fund Grandma left me?" I asked. "I hired forensic accountants. They traced every hidden account, every shell company, and every forged signature you used to bury the theft. The lawsuit was filed months ago. This morning the court granted the final order. Your assets, savings, investments, the rental property, are frozen. The judgment includes 16 years of compounded interest, plus penalties. You owe far more than you possess." My father half rose from his chair, his face purple with rage. "You ungrateful little—" One of my sons stood up, his voice low and hard as stone. "You don't talk to her. Not now. Not ever." My father sat back down, silenced by the stature and cold resolve of his own grandsons. "There's more," I added. "I purchased the debt on your home 2 months ago. You failed to disclose pending legal actions in your mortgage terms, which is a covenant violation. The notice of default is in that folder. You have 30 days to vacate." The news of their fall spread like wildfire. My sons had worked with an investigative journalist to ensure the public record of the fraud was exposed. The social damage was instantaneous and absolute. Their country club membership was revoked, their friends vanished, and the Scottsdale property was auctioned off. An audit of their finances revealed years of unreported income and fake business deductions, triggering a criminal investigation by the district attorney. My father faces charges that will cost him his professional license and potentially his freedom. The last time I saw my mother was in a courthouse hallway during a preliminary hearing. She looked smaller, aged by the sudden collapse of the cruelty that had sustained her for so many years. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. I simply walked past her, focused on the life I had built, not the ghosts I had finally laid to rest. They didn't just lose me. They lost everything, because they never understood that family is not a status to be exploited. It is a bond to be earned.